Hello everyone, welcome back to the Untitled Marvel Project, the show where we typically be ranking and reviewing every single MCU film, but we are continuing our quest, the final step in the Raimi trilogy of Spider-Man films. We're ranking and reviewing every live-action Spider-Man film. I'm your host, Hannah Dykstra, the long-lost relative of visual effects supervisor John Dykstra, who was robbed of his spot on this movie, might I add. We'll talk about
And we will
that.
riot!
We will riot. And I'm, of course, joined by my fellow rioters, Tucker Hazel and Abram Buhner.
Yes, we
Boys,
are.
welcome to the show. We are talking about Spider-Man 3, a contentious film. Perhaps the spookiest to talk about on this fine Hallows Eve.
That's true. It is Halloween as we're recording this.
Yes. But I think we all have very different takes on this film, which will make for a very interesting discussion. If you want more interesting discussions, you should subscribe to Backlog Banter. We're trying to hit 500, maybe past that by the end of the year. So if you could contribute to
Maybe
that,
past this by the time that this fucking video goes up.
maybe. If you could help contribute to that, we'd be very grateful. Tell a friend about us. You know, spread the words. Spread the good news.
A stranger.
A stranger, even.
On the street, tap him on the shoulder.
If you want to talk to strangers,
Whisper in their
actually,
ear.
you could join the Discord for BLB. That link's in the description. But that's enough fapping about.
BLB community.
Join the BLB. That's enough fapping about up top. Let's talk about Spider-Man 3. Tucker, give me your thoughts on Spider-Man 3. I'm putting the spotlight on you, baby.
Spider-Man 3 is one of the interesting films that comes deep from within my childhood. I had a very strange connection to films when I was younger, which is I just had a handful, like 10, that I just watched over and over again. And I wasn't into film history. I wasn't the man that I am now. But Spider-Man 3 was among that top tier, and I always thought that it was by far my favorite live action Spider-Man film until the MCU ones come along, which I do think have a higher bar of quality. And on a rewatch after easily over half a decade since I've seen this film, and looking at it critically, I think this film does a lot right that people don't give it credit for. And there are some who say that it's the best of Sam Raimi's trilogy, and I'm that some.
Oh my god. Tucker is the few, the proud, the brave, the Spider-Man 3 defenders.
That sounds like some sort of military jargon.
It is. It's the Marines thing.
Okay. All right.
Abram, give me your thoughts on Spider-Man 3.
I think this movie's terrible. Here's the thing. I think I had the most fun watching Spider-Man 3 out of all of them. I think we come full circle because if you remember, if people have been watching along, Tucker and I had a lot of issues with the campiness of the first act of Spider-Man 1.
Yeah.
We end where we began with Spider-Man 3. And because of that, I think that this movie is a lot of fun to watch. Raimi just clearly, this has big, like, second semester, senior year energy, this entire movie. And that can be fun, and it is fun. But I think at the same time, I'm so let down by how poorly written I think this movie is. I think it relies entirely on convenience. I think it completely throws away any opportunity to resolve any of the hanging plot threads across the trilogy. The relation between Peter and Harry is solved off screen and through exposition. The relationship between Mary Jane and Peter is unnecessarily and arbitrarily complicated, only to receive no resolution. Random new villains are added just to be added to complicate the Uncle Ben plotline, just to complicate it. Nothing that happens here has any kind of organic place in the larger progression of the Raimi trilogy. And because of that, in spite of how fun it is to watch, it might be the most fun of the three. I think it's easily the worst.
Okay. Well, as I often find myself, I'm somewhere between you two, of leaning towards the Tucker side.
I hate this motherfucker who just always in the middle. Guy, I don't pick a side. I'm just on the fence. Everyone's cool.
But Tucker, I was about to say I agree with you more. Thank you for that. Because Spider-Man 3 is good, actually. If you don't think so...
There you go. Title of the video right there.
You're actually, probably. Thank you for clicking on the title of this video. But if you don't think so, you're just wrong. Sorry. This is the one opinion that is factually true, okay?
That's true. Yeah, there's a lot of opinions out there, but when you narrow it down, you got your fucking metal detector, beep, 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 looking through the beaches of opinions, and you're like, aha! I found the one.
The one that is
the
true.
factual opinion. Yeah.
And that is, it's messy, I'll give it that. There is a much better movie in here, but I think it's pretty good. Despite its flaws, I think the highs are higher and the lows are... They're issues. No, don't get me wrong, but the lows, they kind of get balanced.
Aren't those lows people say?
They aren't as low as people say. Thank you, Tucker.
Yeah.
But
I think where this movie comes down to, and what Abrams started his sort of tirade against this film with, is the relationship between Harry Osborn and Peter Parker is, I think, the main element dragging this film down from genuine greatness. I think that if Harry's whole fucking plot line of wanting revenge for his father and becoming a secondary goblin and not very interesting character, and his sort of battle with Peter and losing his memory and coming back and then manipulating, all that stuff is so weird and superfluous and tangential and doesn't feel like it fits in the progression of this film, that if that was cut, I think that this would be the best Spider. It's my favorite, and I think it's one of the. I think it's the best of the trilogy, but I think it would be definitively the best of the trilogy if that was cut out.
I think that's really interesting because I think that there is a possibility where this movie ends up being great with this plot line removed. Because I agree with you. I really think that I don't think it's the only one that drags the movie down, as I want to discuss, but I think it's sort of at the nexus of almost all of the film's issues.
Yeah.
Because this was the conflict set up by the previous two films.
Yes.
And
sort of weirdly, the progression of that is really awkward and forced, of like him be like immediately like, hate Spider-Man. I hate Spider-Man.
Yeah, but ultimately that's what we were building towards. That is true. He was the unresolved character. Even the Mary Jane and Peter storyline kind of closed itself off after 2, which is why everything that happens with her is so weird, and I want to talk about it. But specifically to the point about Harry, he exemplifies why I think this movie does not work for me. Everything that happens to him is purely a function of plot level convenience. His amnesia is complete convenience that ends up having literally no effect on what happens later, because his amnesia is removed again through complete plot convenience.
Wait, hold on. I watched this movie last night. I'm having amnesia. How does it come back?
He talks to the goblin mask.
That's right.
He talks to Goblin Ghost.
Back. Yeah.
And then that leads to the plot line of MJ pretending to hate Peter for no reason, which is also never resolved and comes out of nowhere. Everything that happens with Harry happens just to motivate another action, which stands completely at odds with the goal of resolving what was a very human and established relationship between the two, as they have to wrestle with Peter's dual identity as Harry figures out. But that's never reconciled or addressed, because the movie would much rather take these circuitous and bizarre choices on a plot level that ultimately does nothing to flesh out this relationship or nothing to motivate the overall story.
Yeah,
and that's kind of my problem.
I think this is maybe the one point that we're all going to agree on here is the fact that the way that they handle the Harry Peter stuff in this movie is very undercooked and very underserved based on what we have set up in the previous
lots
two
of
movies.
Food metaphors here.
Thank you.
Underdigested, maybe, to complete
Underdigested,
that
tangent,
yeah.
But
cooked,
I think
served and digested.
What? I don't know. I don't know what's going on, but what I was going to say was that the main issue that people point to with Spider-Man 3 is how each of the three villains, the three conflicts, are sort of balanced out through the film. Because, as Abrams said, the amnesia thing is just a delaying device, so we can, have an hour of movie that doesn't have Harry being an antagonist to Peter, so we can focus on the other two antagonists.
The one thing I actually would say
of the movie
is that it does, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing, but it does serve a function of giving MJ sort of a place to go back to have a friend in Harry and have their relationship build, which is why it's not great, but somewhat more reasonable that she goes along with his manipulation and he's the other guy and all that. They do have that connection there. They do have that kiss. That is what I think that whole plotline is intending to set up, to complicate the three of their relationship and giving him a reason to not be pure evil still. And why I think it does make a slightly more sense that he's able to come around at the end. He has this sort of battle in his own brain between the amnesia Harry, who is still friends with them and is kind of just a bumbling idiot with a fucking big ass grin on his face all the time, and the revenge that he's still cooking deep inside.
See, my problem with that, though, is that the revenge Harry is still the one that wants to save Peter and MJ. You know, ultimately, he could have still been manipulating MJ in the absence of his amnesia. That whole sequence, MJ...
True. That is true.
MJ goes to him. If he wants to fuck over Peter, as he does shortly after in the movie, he could have just lied to MJ very easily, as he forces her to do to Peter.
That's definitely true.
you get to the real crux of the issue being Barnard, whatever his fuck name is,
Bernard.
who shows
Bernard. He says
Bernard is how they say it.
Who is always like, he's like Alfred, but if Alfred was never in the Batman movies, he was just like a background piece, like set dressing.
Yeah.
Bernard shows up to just complete the resolution. He just solves the problem. He's like, Harry.
The blade that pierced your father's body came from his own glider.
Which, first of all, does not absolve Spider-Man.
No, absolutely not.
And second of all,
yes.
It makes no sense on a plot or a character level that that's how that gets addressed. And that's just very frustrating to me.
Yeah, no good. But I think we can continue down this path, unless we have other stuff to talk. I actually do have other stuff to talk about with Harry Osborn or his dual role as New Goblin. But I think we can continue down this path of talking about the three villains, which are subsequently the biggest issue that people point
Abel's
to.
breathing and moving his eyebrows.
Now,
But
Tanner, I was hoping to use Harry as an opportunity to talk about one more larger thing. If you'd oblige me.
Sure, you can go ahead, and then I want to talk about his role as New Goblin, just to poke fun at it a little bit.
I think that Harry's dialogue in this movie is emblematic of both why I think it works and doesn't work, just as a whole entity, right? And I think we can kind of talk about the overall tone of the movie, of saving the horse shit of emo Peter when we get to emo Peter.
Oh, I'm so excited.
I can't wait for emo Peter. But the scene where Harry tells Peter that he is the other woman in MJ's life, and he's fucking winking at the camera and saying that the pie tastes good and all of that.
So good.
That for me, that sequence is why I think this is the most fun but worst movie in the trilogy. Because because the tone is completely at odds with what the movie is trying to accomplish. My biggest problem with Spider-Man 3 is that it has literally no focus and no direction for where it's trying to go, in effect. Because it has a beginning, middle, and an end, but it does nothing to build upon what the trilogy did in the past. And what was effective about Spider-Man 2 is how it in turn strengthens Spider-Man 1 by developing the relationships that we began with in the first movie.
Yeah.
Here, it's a complete non sequitur. The jokes are a non sequitur. Everything is a non sequitur. And I think the pie jokes, the fucking throwing cars around, all of this stuff, all of the weirdness of that scene, the disappearing and reappearing, it's fun, but it's completely hollow.
Tucker?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I would turn that around to talk about sort of what I think the reason I think this movie does work with, which is something that I disagree with what you just said, but we can save that for after we finish Tanner's thing, because we're going in a little order here. You want to talk about something, finishing that tangent. I'll let him finish his tangent, then we'll talk about my tangent.
Okay.
I just like Spider-Man 3, we're just a bunch of
conflicting plot points.
Yeah, exactly. We're bouncing around, just like Harry's head bounced around in that first action scene. Because I want to talk about New Goblin and the action scenes, because I think the action sequences in this film are also a pretty big issue. Like, 40% of them exist in like a 2007, we can do a fight scene all in CGI, right guys, sort of space where there's no weight to anything, everything looks goofy and rubbery. It is like, I thought of this comparison this morning. You guys remember that scene in the first Raimi Spider-Man when he's like testing out his powers and he's running and he's jumping from roof to roof and it looks really rubbery? It's that, but they have confidence in that it actually looks good because they keep doing it over and over and they focus on it. Like, there is like half a dozen CGI Peter Parkers in this that look like a PS2 cutscene. It looks pretty bad.
Yes.
It's like the New Goblin stuff when he's like flying between the buildings. He's just like, James Franco's just like ducking on a green screen set. It looks bad, and that's basically my point. And that New Goblin is a nothing character. They could have made him Hobgoblin just to give him like a recognizable comic book origin thing, but no, let's make him like a snowboard guy, I guess.
He's a Sonic Riders character.
Thank you.
Oh my god.
The fight sequences are spatially incomprehensible. That is my problem with them. It is impossible to tell where anything is. Because what they do is, and Tanner, you were saying this, we were just hanging out in voice chat the other night, that these movies are kind of a reflection of the time in terms of filmmaking and tone. This is like the quick cut Jason Bourne style action, but there is no action actually being performed. It's all effect shots.
Yeah.
And because of that, it literally is just like a smudge And in that first scene when they're fighting between the buildings, I literally could not tell what direction they
Right.
were moving.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Tanner and I would look at each other just constantly like, what the fuck did we just
What
watch?
just
Like,
happened?
the scenes conclude, the fights end at some point, and then we're like, oh, like you're fucking jarred back to reality. Like, did I get punched in the head for the last 10 minutes? I don't know what fucking happened. But I think the worst part, and the reason I think those don't work so well, is they use a lot of airtime in these.
Yes.
Spider-Man is flying, Sandman is up in the air, New Goblin's on his fucking dumb snowboard. All of that is in the air, which means that there's no real gravity because they're gravity defying characters. They're falling, which means that the speed that they're falling doesn't make a lot of sense because they're falling slower than you would want them to in reality, and the buildings are just repeating as they're falling in the background, and the fucking ring is falling, and that should have hit the ground fucking 20 seconds. It's really awkward because I think they think that they can do mid-air combat really well. And to be honest, I think if you pause it and look at the CGI of the suits and stuff, it's not bad, but it's the movement and the gravity that doesn't work. I think they got really overconfident in we can animate these characters to look like they're realistic, which is true. This has the best CGI, I think, in the series, but the movement is what really screws that over.
See, I think that this devolves a little bit in terms of CGI, but that's just like there are points where it's better and points where it's worse for sure.
I think, I mean, that's not a bad segue into Sandman because I think Sandman is emblematic of both that good and bad CGI.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
the problem is there are too many solely like spectacle effects shots in this movie. Like the construction of Sandman, which reminded me of a Bionicle game I played on PS2.
Wait, what do you mean?
In large part.
Which scene?
Like
the scene where when he's actually Sandman, he's like in that pile and he's like trying to grab the locket and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Like when he's actually fighting Peter and Peter's punches are going through him. Whenever
That's so great.
Yeah, when they slow down those action sequences, they are pretty good. Like I do think there are genuinely a couple of good action sequences here, but there's just too much of a focus on trying to impress us with CGI. But Sandman, what do we think of Sandman?
Sandman, best villain in this movie. I really think that's
probably.
True. Because
around,
I think
probably.
that fucking Flint Marko, thank you, I almost forgot his last name, but
Flint
Marko is, Flint Lockwood, is I think the most interesting new character in this film from a story perspective. He actually has a pretty reasonable motivation. I think he's a much more believable villain than especially the other two. And as you're saying, that CGI is hit or miss because they're not quite there yet, but a lot of the choreography and ways that he uses his powers are great. I mean, the fight between him and Peter put Peter in his overconfidence, which we'll get to, into a place where nothing he's trained himself to do over the last 5 years is working. He has to find out new strategies to take down this guy that's doing things that are not physical prowess like he used to. He has to outsmart him, which is, I think, a really interesting way to position that villain. And all the ways that he's incorporated into the story, this is something that a lot of people would disagree with, but I think that they're handled really well. I think if the movie was given more time for him to be on screen consistently throughout the movie, if he had a slightly larger role to play, he would be probably my favorite villain in the series because I think that his story is good. I do think that Thomas Hayden Church does a good job portraying the emotion that not a lot of the other villains have gotten a chance to have. And I like his choreography and power usage quite a lot.
Yeah, I'd agree. I like the power usage. I've never been a fan, however, of the Uncle Ben retcon with Flint Marko shooting him on accident, even. Because Tucker and I talked about this. It works in terms of the film because they couldn't feasibly add another conflict for him and Peter to have like this sort of internal grudge against each other. This film's messy enough as it is on a plot level. So for what the film is, they have to do that and it's fine. But I've never personally been a fan of it because it sort of does take away that thing from Spider-Man 1 where Peter kills the first person he ever fights, the first person he ever kills is the guy who robs the wrestling tournament and kills Uncle Ben. And he sort of has to, he backs away from that extreme of using his power for irresponsible means and follows Uncle Ben's advice. It's that quote of, with great power comes great responsibility. I'm not sure if you guys had heard of that before. But I think it takes away from that. But at the end of the day, I can excuse it.
I can't excuse it personally because I think what I really ended up loving about Spider-Man 2 in particular is that it is a movie that had more than just a Spider-Man plot. It had an actual
Hmm.
heart to it. Peter was a character with these complex motivations, and there was a theme. Spider-Man 1, Spider-Man 2 had a theme, and Uncle Ben, Peter's relationship to him, the fallout from that was so integral. Introducing this monkey wrench again comes back to my idea of this being just a film that motivates itself through unnecessary and inorganic plot ideas. The fact that Flint Marko shows up and then just shoots Uncle Ben because why? Like even it was the gun misfired, but why was the actual mechanics of how he was killed are already shaky enough. But then when you introduce that as a way to have Peter grapple with revenge doesn't even really track with me because we've had to grapple with this already. He already killed that first person, and
Hmm.
why can't he just feel remorse about that action? Or why can't under the symbiote power he kill somebody else? The Uncle Ben plotline is so airtight and so central to how so many different characters are motivated in the first two movies that adding Flint Marko like this just does not work to me
Hmm.
because it's just an unnecessary complication to deal with themes that could have been funneled elsewhere. On top of the fact that in Flint Marko, I just don't think is compelling enough by his own right for me to justify his inclusion into that storyline because his daughter is sick. Okay, we don't really ever we see one scene of him
Hmm.
interacting with his daughter. We don't even know what his daughter is sick with. We don't know who his daughter is. We see her in a locket. We see her in a scene. And then he disappears only to reappear at the end and take a hostage and cause a humongous crisis when he's a man
Yeah.
who is not here to cause that kind of chaos. He's like, you see him on sitting on top of the building at the end of the film. And he's like, this is not what I wanted to be. But nobody forced him into that position. He's a
Yeah.
character that exists only to motivate a plot line that I think stands at odds with why the first two films worked on a thematic level.
I actually I disagree with a lot of that. I think that his inclusion in that Uncle Ben storyline is a retcon, and the way that it is introduced through the cost suddenly being like, "Oh, bring! Somehow we found out that we got the wrong guy."
Right.
I think that is the shoehorn of like forcing that storyline into this film that feels really awkward. But I personally think that the way that this film wrestles with its core theme, I think you're wrong about this film not having a theme. The core theme of Peter's overconfidence, of him receiving so much love from all these angles that it's all gone to his head and he has to learn to recenter himself. The way that I think recenters him very well is complicating his relationship to the thing that he had come to terms with, the death of Uncle Ben. The fact that you're inserting something new in there and giving him this situation where he's now experienced as Spider-Man, he's learned that mistake, but he made a mistake on top of that mistake, and
Hmm.
he has to come to terms with the fact that he isn't as infallible as he thought he was, and combine that with the symbiote and combine that with the fact that he at the end has to come to terms with the guy that did kill my uncle isn't actually that bad of a person. I don't have to kill him. The symbiote has left me. All these factors come together, I think, really narrow down to the central theme of Peter as a person and coming to terms with his abilities and the strength that he has and not letting that go to his head. All of that storyline works really well. It is poorly introduced, but the way that that impacts Peter as a character, I think, is important enough and connects the entire trilogy enough to where I'm glad that it's introduced. I think that him, Sandman being the actual killer, is a strong enough concept for both Flint Marko and Peter Parker to justify its inclusion.
Sure. Actually, I mean, Tucker brings up a good point of how Peter made that mistake in Spider-Man 1. He went too far. He killed I forget, I don't know if that guy even had a name. The blonde guy
No,
with
I
the
don't think
Probably
so.
frosted tip.
probably did, but
The
whatever.
the balding guy with the frosted tips in the bright orange shirt. But it is interesting how they rekindle that in Spider-Man 3
Exactly,
and have
exactly.
it complicated with the fact that Flint Marko didn't mean to, and Spider-Man gets to show his growth over the course of these 3 years, I think it's been canonically or so, and let the guy who actually killed him go.
Yeah.
I can see arguments for how that's retconning and rewriting and taking away from that, but I can also see arguments about how it's a bringing back, it's a rekindling, it's a second attempt for Spider-Man that shows his
Exactly.
growth.
Exactly.
The reason I disagree is because you don't need to do that to have this theme present. Tucker, I totally agree that that is the theme of the movie, but that theme can exist without, in my opinion, disrupting that plot line from the first two films.
Hmm.
Why couldn't Sandman have robbed that bank? Aunt May was in the bank. Aunt May gets really hurt. Peter thinks, okay, fuck, I watched what happened to Uncle Ben. I'm not going to let this happen again. I'm
Sure.
going to kill Sandman. Then he has the same conversation with Aunt May about revenge. She says, even though he came after my life, I would never want someone to, in my name, enact revenge like that.
Hmm.
You can
Sure.
have this same plot line exist without undermining what had already happened in the previous films.
I just don't
And
necessarily see how it's undermining because I do think see it as a recomplication that allows him to learn from his mistakes and apply his growth to that.
well, it's a undermining because it's just poorly written. That's my thing.
I think the introduction is poorly written. I don't
I
think that the inherently the complication of that storyline is a negative aspect.
The reason I do is because it felt so airtight before. Peter made the mistake. That was his past. That was what incited him to be Spider-Man. It was concrete. It forced him and Aunt May to have the conversations they did, and their relationship to change as it did.
Yeah,
That was finite. But
but
my
it
thing
still
is
was like that for 5 years because they didn't know that information. I mean,
right, but
learning extra information years down the line, I don't think takes away from the impact that it had for all those years because that's what he believed.
But the reason I do is because it's just not well assembled. He gets brought into the police station under this pretense that they had information percolating for years and witness testimony to that effect, but it was never brought forward. That
Mhm.
doesn't make any sense. Him being there and then the gun just randomly discharging to kill Uncle Ben is complete convenience. And then he ends up on the street. And then we never see enough of Flint Marko as Flint Marko opposed to Sandman to humanize that character in a way for us to relate to him as Peter. Because why should Peter even give him the time of day? Sure, he has a daughter who's sick, but all of his rogues gallery have some kind of justification for that. And the only action Sandman
Is that true
takes,
though?
or some kind of
Actually,
justification.
none of the other three in this series have that humanizing element necessarily.
Right, but if the point is we're trying to humanize the relationship between Flint and Peter, well then we should really actually humanize Flint, but we don't because the only actions he takes after having a daughter who's sick is to rob a bank, kill some police officers, and then cause a crisis in New York, a hostage crisis. None of that is sympathetic. It's I don't necessarily dislike the idea of complicating Ben's death, but I dislike it when it just feels like it's so ham-fisted.
Okay, I'm gonna step in right here. I'm gonna bring this conversation to a close because we should probably move on to other elements of the film. But I will say that yes, in a perfect world, it would be given more time. Maybe it would
Yes.
be given. Maybe it'd be
More
given
time in instead of including fucking dumb new goblin.
instead of
Yeah.
New Goblin. Maybe we include, like what Abram said, a new element that reflects the Uncle Ben death that doesn't
Sure.
actually, undermine it to some arguments. At the same time, though, I will play defense for. I have to correct a few statements that Abram said. I think in the movie, I think it's implied that the gun fires because blonde frosted tip man bumps like
Bumps into him.
he
Yes.
runs into him.
But that's still so convenient.
Exactly. It is an explanation that is slightly better than the gun misfiring or whatever. But it is still a convenience thing. And he only robs the banks and wants to kill Spider-Man because Spider-Man is the only thing in the way of him getting money to his daughter. He's gonna stop him from robbing banks and being a criminal and getting money
Yeah,
to his
because
daughter.
no one else can physically stop him. There's no one else literally in this city who has the ability to stop him from achieving that goal. If he gets that out of the way, he's previously already a criminal. He's not adverse to ending someone's life to justify that means, and
But
so
if
he worked to do that. I think that does make sense.
But if Flint Marko is a good man, why doesn't he just have a conversation with Peter as he does at the end of the movie anyway? Why does he incite the hostage crisis? Why does this stuff happen?
Well,
It
because
feels
it's because
yeah,
The only
He has-
experience he's had with Peter is Peter beating the fuck out of him and
Yeah.
pouring down a drain. So
To be
it's like,
fair,
okay,
though-
this guy who's attacked me 3 times and won't listen to me is coming back. Okay, why would he listen to me now?
And the actual reason in the film is that we needed a third act, and Venom and Sandman needed to team up.
that's my
Yes.
point.
And
Yes.
I will say
That's my point.
that scene right there is where the third act of this thing kicks off, and is where I
It doesn't
lean more
kick off. It kicks you in the fucking teeth.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
biggest problem that Tanner and I both have with this film is the initiation of that third act is literally Venom just becoming
crawling on
Venom,
the wall.
appearing in a fucking alleyway
Alleyway.
and just being like, all right, kill the spider, boom, and then third act, and that I think is the biggest problem with this film because up before that, I think there are some problems with pacing, mostly because you're cutting between so many different storylines. But when we get to talk, I think as we're wrapping this up after Venom, talking about the themes of this film, all those plot lines do feed into this central theme, I think, in a very compelling way. It really is just, oh, we need a final action set piece. Let's kick it off. And that last 25 minutes is where the problems of this movie really come to fruition, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Venom.
It's Venom time.
Venom.
Let's talk about the symbiote. Let's talk about Venom. Let's talk about Eddie Brock. Because those are three distinct elements that are kind of the same in the script that I feel very differently towards. The inclusion of the symbiote is good and works towards the themes of this film. It works towards Peter's internal stakes and adds to the external stakes as well. Eddie Brock, I don't love Topher Grace as Eddie Brock, but I think Tucker brought up a good point last night where he's like, it's like a new era sort of Eddie Brock, where he's like sort of a Weasley guy who like lies about taking photographs and stuff like that to get ahead in the world. And Venom is bad. The Eddie Brock symbiote team up is bad. But I want to hear what you guys' thoughts on it are.
I think the symbiote is good, and we're going to talk about this. This episode's going long of UMP. I'm telling you.
That's right.
We have a lot we have to talk about still,
Yeah.
but I like the symbiote. I think the explanation of the symbiote could have been better, but ultimately,
Yeah.
fine. Whatever. It's here. It's at a certain point you have to accept that this movie is just, it doesn't have time to have that kind of conversation. The symbiote is here. If you know what a symbiote is, fine, good, whatever. And that motivates emo Peter and all that. So that is, I think, probably one of the only new additions to this Raimi verse that makes sense to me. I don't like Venom. That goes without saying. I don't even think we really need to harp on that too much. I don't like Eddie Brock either, though. The reason I don't like Eddie Brock is the kind of the same reason I don't like Gwen Stacy, which we'll talk about when we get to the MJ stuff, is that Eddie Brock just comes out of nowhere, and I like the idea of him challenging Peter. I think that's really actually fun for the job of the newspaper. I think that's all great. But what I don't like is the fact that he is just a scumbag and a bad journalist, and then his motivation, sure, it's fueled by the symbiote, but he starts hating Peter because Peter called him out for journalistic malpractice.
Yeah.
Like he has no leg to stand on. He's not.
But I think that's the reason that he works so well as not a villain in terms of Venom, because Venom is weak as we've gotten to, but as an antagonist to Peter Parker, he's so morally ambiguous and stuck in his own mind. The opposite of Peter Parker, who puts everyone else before the needs of himself. Eddie Brock is the anti-Peter Parker, I think, in every way. He doesn't have that journalistic integrity. He is a lot more confident with women and leaning on his own abilities, which is the theme of this film. He reflects that externalization of Peter's conflict in this film in a way that also adds a lot of personality and conflict in the Bugle storyline, allows there to be more of that journalistic boots on the ground sort of taking pictures of Spider-Man thing. And the way that his personality bounces off of both Spider-Man and Peter Parker works very well. And I think that all ties into, again, the theme of this film. Eddie Brock builds that up. He worked as a great addition to this cast because he supports the theme. I think he's really funny. I think his chemistry with Tobey Maguire is actually really great. The problem comes with him and the symbiote combined to become Venom, but I think individually both of those are great additions to the cast and flow and personality of this film that I'm very glad both of them are there.
I mean, they do work as very good foils to each other. I think you're totally right about that. But there just is not enough screen time for that to be developed at all. The scenes between Eddie and Peter are so few and far between. Their entire relationship is sparked up and unfolds in minutes. Most of the time is actually spent between either Eddie and Spider-Man or Venom and Spider-Man. And that's fine, but the real heart of what you're talking about, Tucker, is shown very few and far between. And it's actually only just the emo Peter who is basically operating as Eddie does that we see them interact. So we never really actually get to see Peter have to wrestle with the fact that this person is getting ahead of him in all of these facets by being a bad guy. Peter never has to wrestle with exposing that photograph, never has to actually confront Eddie on any front other than in combat, really. And because of that, there's just no time for what is a really good idea, as you're saying, to actually play out, because this film does have a theme. but we have to like connect the point over here to the theme over here with a lot of projection, I think, because the amount of screen time and the dialogue given to this idea is just not there, in my opinion, to flesh it out.
Well, I think regardless of or Abrams' statements and Tucker's disagreements, it doesn't really matter to me because I think that the core of the trifecta of Eddie Brock, the symbiote, and the combination of Venom is the symbiote and Peter. I think Eddie Brock I can take or leave essentially based on what side I want to fall on with you two guys. But the symbiote and Peter is the really important part of this to me,
Yes.
and how
Yeah.
it feeds into Peter's ego of being loved by everything. Everything's coming up Peter. He's got the girl. He's getting married. He's got a... what else is going right for Peter? I don't really remember.
I
But
mean,
He's doing
everything
well in his
kind of.
classes.
he's doing well in his classes.
And
New York
literally
loves
fucking
him.
everyone and his mother is parading around the city with shirts and fucking blimps and everything.
Yes.
I just love Spider-Man. And initially, as we were getting into that, I was like, this is fucking overkill. This is ridiculous. Like, end of Spider-Man 2, yeah, like a handful of people on the bus are proud of him. But I actually think that as it progressed, I was like, no, this is actually a really interesting way to tell a Spider-Man story that has him deal with a conflict that he's not used to dealing with. We know Peter Parker as this really relatable, grounded guy who makes some quips and has crazy powers, but at the end of the day, he's, struggling with everything. He's struggling with his money, with relationships, with balancing his time management, all that. Taking Peter Parker out of that context and having everything the Parker luck just go out the window and have everything coming up Peter is a great way to introduce a complexity to that character that I don't give a shit if it's overkill that they're handing him the fucking key to the city and have 20,000 parades every day just to celebrate how great of a guy he is. I found throughout the film that externalization actually helped to reflect the theme even stronger. And it's really fun visually of everyone wearing fucking Spider-Man shirts and every news line is just like, Spider-Man is the greatest guy to ever exist. And it's crazy and campy. And that's one of the campy elements that really works for me.
I agree. This is the part of the movie that worked for me almost without reservation. Is this plot line?
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's he is not relatable, but in not being relatable, he kind of becomes relatable again. Sort of watching him from the outside lose himself,
Yeah,
and you wanting him to come back down to earth. I think that's really great. I think that this should have been the movie, and ultimately, I mean, Spider-Man 3 is just a textbook case of Sony Pictures saying "fuck you, where's Venom," which is unfortunate because I think that if the movie Spider-Man 3 was closing off the relationships and the plot threads we'd set up, and then this, it would have been a fantastic end to the trilogy. Because I agree with you, Tucker, that this theme is really good, and it sometimes on a plot level it pans out really well, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think we can use this to talk about how it affects his relationship with MJ. Because
the one thing I would say though is this storyline I personally think is the core of this film and why it works so well.
I would
As
say
we're
that
talking
too,
about
yeah.
each of these elements, I can very clearly tell how this connects back to that theme. We're talking about Eddie Brock and his overconfidence, or Peter's overconfidence being externalized in that antagonist. The symbiote, which we're going to talk about and sort of spun off into this, is a very clear connection to this, and the way that is another externalization of he now actually has the power to act in this, and his sort of darker themes of being overconfident and not having that grounded personality, being he's now evil because he has a fucking symbiote living in his asshole or whatever. Like I do think that works really well, and I can't really see this storyline working as well without the black suit and symbiote storyline being externally reflected. I think that's one of the most powerful connections of this film. The storyline of Peter being overconfident and having everything be powerful. Yeah, that's what the black suit storyline is. So Sam Raimi had to include Venom, but the symbiote's one of the strongest aspects of this film.
No, I agree with you. I just think that there's so much other shit in the periphery that distracts from it. That's my thing. You could have told the symbiote storyline without all of the added encumbrance of who Eddie Brock is and what he becomes as Venom and Sandman and all of this, and trying to wrap up a new Goblin, right? If we had just focused on the symbiote, had we just focused on this theme, as you're saying, is present in the movie, it would have been stronger instead of it being muddied by all these other elements.
Yeah, I think it's great that it permeates all of the different elements of this movie. And it is really interesting, like Tucker said, that Sam Raimi didn't want to do Venom, But in the script writing process, he made it work like really well and made it the core of this film. That's a real testament to Sam Raimi, if anything else. And but I
Also,
also
well, just a quick thing to say: the best CGI in this movie is that symbiote. It
Oh, yeah.
moving around, it
Yeah.
grabbing things, it like the shadow coming up over the wall and grabbing him, and like spidering around on shit. That looks great.
It looks
looks
good.
awesome.
I don't think it's interesting, and we'll get to this eventually when we talk about maybe the MJ thing that we keep bringing up and saying, oh, we'll get to it later. Is that Sam Raimi also wanted to make Spider-Man 4. He didn't view this as like the end of these characters and the character journeys. So that I think that also is a really interesting thing to consider. But the symbiote does permeate every aspect of Peter's life. He becomes more aggressive and more of an asshole in his personal life. He becomes more brutal as Spider-Man, especially in that fight with Sandman, which is why I think it's necessary for Sandman to exist in this movie as an external villain for Peter to fight against with the black suit. It's a brutal fight, and the Sandman abilities make for really interesting imagery when he's like grinding his face up against that moving train and stuff like that.
CGI doesn't look great with that, but I like the idea of it.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, it permeates every aspect of his life, and Peter becomes emo Peter, the infamous emo Peter, and I think we just need to talk about it. We just need to talk about it.
I love this sequence. This
It's
is
great.
It
both
is the most
both sequences.
Yes, I'm saying everything from when he fucking drops down to that alleyway and puts his bangs over his eye
Yeah.
to when he has that big conflict.
You actually kind of do have Tobey Maguire like thin hair.
Yeah.
Look, it's me.
That's actually very good.
Yeah, it is.
But what's so great about it is that
Kind of look like Rick Flag.
there is no care given to it making any kind of tonal or thematic sense at all, and it's just fun.
Thematically, I would disagree, but tonally, yes.
Sure,
but also tonally, this is the campiness that people might say is lacking in this film. Sam Raimi leaning all the way into Peter just going full fucking hog, and the editing going bah, 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 and like all this stuff. I think those are some of the best sequences in the film, not because they're really deep or reflect a super strong aspect of Peter's character, but they are fun, they are campy, it is comic booky, and I think it does work to, in its ridiculousness, support that core theme that I'm talking about.
The reason I don't think it does is because none of it ever has to be addressed ever. He hits Mary Jane. He gets into a fight in a club, but it doesn't matter. None of it's addressed.
Not true, because it is in his punching of Mary Jane that he realizes, no, there's something wrong with me. I do need to fight back against these urges. Yeah,
but he never has to confront that with Mary Jane. The Peter Parker identity does not get brought into question. That the suit is shown to people in the bar and he covers it up, but that doesn't matter. That's my thing about it not mattering thematically, because it incites Peter to get the symbiote off of him, but it doesn't actually force him to I can have a conversation with Mary Jane about, oh my God, I just hit you. Oh my God, people might know who I am. They see this suit. None of that ends up mattering. It flips so hard into the camp direction that it becomes really fun, but it doesn't really mean anything more than on a plot level.
I think it's also important for me to bring up again that Sam Raimi didn't plan for this to be the end of these character journeys, the end of these movies.
True, but it is.
Yes,
from our perspective.
Exactly. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the thing I think about that is I think you're right, is there's not an aftermath of that would have been really interesting to play with, because we go right into the third act after that ends. Like I think the problem is not necessarily those sequences, the way that they're leading up, the way that Peter hits MJ and has to be like, oh fuck, okay, I have to deal with this now, take off the fucking thing. Then it drops down the bell tower, gets on Eddie Brock.
I love that sequence.
Eddie Brock goes,
yeah,
okay, Sandman, let's beat up Spider-Man. And kaboom, we're into the third act.
I love the sequence, by the way, where he's in the church and he's like, I come to you humbly with one request. Kill Peter Parker.
Which is an insane sequence, but it's great. It is fun.
Yeah, obviously it's reminiscent. I think it's a direct reference to the origin of Venom and Eddie Brock in the comics. I think that's exactly what happens.
I thought it was a reference to the end of Godfather Part 1.
I think it's probably both. Speaking of Godfather Part 1, I think what we were saying was that this movie needs to be 3 hours. Just make Spider-Man 3 3 hours so we can have all this stuff. We wrap it all up.
Maybe.
We give it all a bunch of time, and yeah.
Raimi cut.
So
Cut. Let's go.
forget Spider-Man 4. We're doing Spider-Man 3 the ultimate cut, okay?
Yeah, no, it's whatever fucking Kill Bill. What's it called? The killiest cut. What's the long
Oh, I
version
don't know.
of 1 and 2?
I
It's
know what
like
you
that.
mean,
It's
though.
2 movies in one, but they call it 1 movie.
Yeah.
We're talking about MJ.
We talk about MJ, but first, speaking of Spider-Man 4 and rolling it into Spider-Man 3, I want to bring up Bruce Campbell in this because I don't know if we've ever talked about him directly in any of these videos. He's fantastic. I love him.
Holy fuck,
I
he's so
just
funny.
I just wait for him to show up in every one of these movies. In this one, it's romance. I am
I am
French.
French. And the whole bit of Peter wanting to get or him thinking that Peter wants the fucking ring to be brought to him. He's like, oh no.
No.
It's really
Uh,
good.
But MJ,
But he's also supposed to be Mysterio, which is why I think you were saying
yes,
the setup
he's
thing.
supposed to be Mysterio in Spider-Man
Oh.
4. And I
Mhm.
think I like to think that Sam Raimi thought that every one of his characters in the 3 Spider-Man movies were just Quentin Beck showing up at different points in Peter's life. I think that's cool.
what I assumed.
That would have
I-
been really cool.
Yeah.
That's a cool idea.
But
And it's
MJ,
hey, it's also possible that we see him in Multiverse of Madness
I-
as an alternate reality Mysterio.
I
It's fucking possible.
I would
multiple
scream
reasons.
at the top of my lungs like a little girl in the theater if I saw Bruce Campbell in Spider-Man No Way Home.
Holy fuck.
MJ,
Actually, Tanner, that's the Doctor Strange movie.
I said
Versus
that, and I meant
Madness.
it.
I was gonna say.
Oh no, you're right.
Yeah. I was gonna say. Speaking of screaming at the top of our lungs, MJ, because she screams a
don't-
lot in these movies.
She does.
Yeah.
Can I
She
just
does,
say?
but I feel like in this movie she doesn't do it like out of context. Like she's in some very real danger in this film.
Well,
so,
yeah,
like,
but she's
yelling.
always. The thing is that she's always kidnapped in the third act, and she's
Sure.
always screaming, "Peter!"
I mean, I don't think it's going to be very. I don't think I have to telegraph particularly strongly that I don't like the Mary Jane stuff in this movie. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I'll lay it out so you can refute it if you feel necessary. But this is to me perhaps the epitome of this movie introducing non sequiturs to fuck up the trajectory of a 3-film relationship unfolding. Because the injection of Gwen Stacy makes basically no sense. She has just been in the background in his lab partner, but they're flirting, and then for no reason he kisses her, but maybe because he's attracted to her, but maybe because he's high on power as Spider-Man, but really just so Mary Jane doesn't want to marry Peter, so he can kick that can down the road further. And then we're getting closer again, but then Harry has to come and make sure that the marriage doesn't happen, just to make Peter really sad. Mary Jane just becomes a plot device mediated by other plot devices, and that's just really disappointing because their relationship made genuine progress in 1 and 2. And then when they in the third act, in the end of the second, when they actually have to confront something serious, the movie ends before it can. I think Mary Jane gets completely wasted in this movie, and their progression from the second movie into here is just thrown to the side. But there are interesting aspects, like it ties back in, Tucker, to what you're saying about the theme about Peter being overconfident and Mary Jane's career falling apart. But that is just an idea that never goes anywhere.
I'd say that it
I
comes up a
disagree.
number of times. Like,
Yeah.
I think that the dialogue scenes of Peter making like a very human mistake of saying like, "Oh, the thing that you're struggling with, I struggle with all the time. Here, let me tell you about it." Like, that's his ego coming through, but it's also like not an unrealistic thing because lots of people do that. They empathize the wrong way. They center themselves instead of the person that they're in a relationship with. It is a very common like relationship struggle, but also God forbid that we ever have a Spider-Man movie where MJ and Peter are together.
No, I agree with you, Tanner. Those are the good scenes, but they don't get resolved really. All it funnels into is her wanting to go to Harry, so then Harry can make a completely arbitrary decision to make them break up, which is never then addressed later on. I agree with you that the nexus of it is very human and very well written, but it just spirals out into nothingness.
Okay.
The reason I would say that I disagree on the whole with most of the points about the MJ relationship is because I think the problem is really the fact it is lacking that resolution. This wasn't intended to be the ending. The ending of this film is with that final act is very messy, but I think everything leading up to that actually does play into these themes very well. The inclusion of Gwen Stacy, I think, is only weird in the fact that it doesn't get resolved, but she is I think, an interesting complication of Peter finally having another girl that's kind of into him and had that boosting his confidence. And the kiss that they have, sure, yeah, he's attracted to her. Bryce Dallas Howard's very attractive. Like, they have that chemistry together. He did save her life. He is drunk with power in front of everyone, and that complicates his relationship with Mary Jane. She gets jealous. He doesn't realize that it's a really big issue. There are a lot of things of that work really well. I like how they are together for between the end of Spider-Man 2 and the third or half of the way through this movie. That's more together time than we've ever seen in one of these fucking movies. And I think it does work really well. We do get to see them sort of have relationship struggles, which we've never gotten to in any other live action Spider-Man media. I think their relationship and chemistry together is better than it's ever been. I think this is the best performance that either of them give in the ways that they interact with one another. And Mary Jane is given so much more interesting emotions and dialogue to play with in this film that Kirsten Dunst does so much better in this role. She's no longer stone-faced. She's laughing, she's crying, she's frustrated with Peter, and the ways that their relationship plays off of one another and into that theme of Peter being overconfident because his relationship is also going well at the beginning. I think it all works really, really well together.
I would agree with Tucker, first off, that, that it is the best performance from each of our three main core actors.
Yeah, even James Franco, this is his best role. Yeah. It does devolve because he's not as great of an edgy person, but when he's being charming and funny and like, hey, Pete, hey, Mary Jane, we're best friends again, he's much better as that.
Or cracking the egg or making the omelet and he fucks up the omelet. Like, he's like a charismatic guy.
Yeah.
Or when
classically
he says,
very unattractive guy.
Or when he says, strawberries.
So good.
So good. Another thing I wanted to bring up, and this is just, I feel like we're winding down here a little bit. It was during the black suit Peter, emo Peter, more brutal fight scene things. When I love that scene of when Harry throws the pumpkin bomb and he just like back at him.
Oh god,
it's great. I love that. That's so cool. We didn't really talk about, but the dancing Peter is just funny. I don't care if it's
so funny.
It's so funny that he's sliding around on chairs and he's doing he's doing all that stuff. It's so funny.
He has that snap where he thrusts out his pelvis.
Now dig on this.
What's the dancing is awesome, but what I love even more is him just walking down the street and doing stupid shit with his hands, and then all the women turn around behind him.
I love that. So I've always been confused by the fact that some of them are like, "Oh yeah, look at this guy," and some of them are like, "You gross, what the hell?"
Yeah, it's that I think it does feed into the idea of Peter is just so in his own fucking head.
Yeah.
Again, it's because of the black suit or whatever, but I do think that works. I think that entire sequence, I would much rather watch that entire sequence than maybe any of the other movies.
Yeah,
and that's just me saying it's really fun out of context. It's really fun.
Yeah. Well, we've gone long on this, and speaking of that, I do want to say this is the longest Raimi Spider-Man movie, but it moves at a clip. I didn't feel this dragging at all. And that might be a thing about maybe some like choppy editing, some poor editing decisions to make this thing just move along without paying attention to a lot of things. But regardless,
it moves along really well. Sometimes it leaves a few elements behind in that moving along really well. But I think on the whole, I never felt this runtime, and that extended runtime does allow you to get a lot of different elements in there. Whether or not some of them pay off, I do think that the inclusion of a lot of these ideas, getting Black Suit and MJ and Peter relationship and Gwen Stacy introduced and Sandman and his relationship with Harry and the whole fucking ending thing. Like, there are a lot of ideas of this film. I think most of them pay off. I think most of them tie in to the core theme of this film, bolster that, add a lot of complexity to Peter as a character and his relationship to the city and being a hero and his history and his powers and all of that. It really is just that ending, the poorly handled relationship with Harry being a fucking half villain that's really awkward and not memorable. That's where the faults of this movie come in. But on the whole, this film works surprisingly well. And I think when you really analyze it from a thematic perspective and how each of these elements feed into his personality and all of that, this film works really, really well.
Abram, do you have anything to say in closing? I'm going to take that as Tucker's closing statement.
That's my closing statement.
I think I'm going to have a come to Jesus moment here. And I hate to say it. You guys talking about this movie is how I imagine. Basically, we're saying that your defense of this movie is my defense of BVS.
Yeah.
And I think that is equitable. And I'll put it out right here. BVS is not an especially great movie. It has a lot of fundamental issues. And this does too, I think. But
Yeah.
it depends on what you are willing to excuse, what you're willing to project into the movie.
Right.
Because each of them has about 6 or 7 ideas, and they put about 15 to 25% into each of them. and the result of that is too much movie and not enough time.
Really,
and right. You have far more movie than you have time to explain it. And Tucker, when you're talking about theme and all these interesting ideas, I agree with you, but from my perspective, they are only ideas. They are not concluded. I have to take what the film gives me in a couple of scenes and project that into a larger idea. I think that this is a messy movie. I think that it is a deeply flawed movie. And I think that in spite of its good ideas, the sum of its parts is just a box of things. And you can take out those things and look at them and think, man, what if this thing had been finished? Mm-hmm. It's a sketchbook full of pages that were not completed. And because of that, I just find it to be really underwhelming when 2 was such an airtight and well put together movie.
I'd say, just to be brief, that I'd say that those parts are more finished than not finished. But ultimately, I agree with both of you. Let's give this film a score.
I got mine typed in.
Okay, all right.
I got open the thing.
Okay.
I'm like Zack Snyder making BVS over here.
He's unprepared. It's Sam Raimi hearing from Avi Arad that he has to put Venom in this movie.
Did you see the quote from the Sony lady who was like, Kevin Feige came in, was like, we're gonna take over Spider-Man, and then I either threw a sandwich at him or started crying.
Yeah, what the hell is that quote? I don't understand that at all. But
I didn't type in.
I didn't know why you would share that.
Countdown. 3, 2, 1. Pop. Oh wow!
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about this. Tucker and I are combined, united, in fact, at a 7.6. Abram coming in at a incredibly low, surprisingly low, 3.4. A 3.4. Might I add, that is half the score that Abram Buner gave to The Incredible Hulk.
Yes.
So
I did. What did I praise in this movie? The fucking emo Peter dance.
Well, that's fair. You did detract from basically every element of the film, so maybe it doesn't not make sense. But regardless,
but to the logical human being.
Yeah, to the logical human being who,
how did
I said, the only factual opinion that exists in the world is that Spider-Man 3 is good. Actually,
yes, sure. This is I gave this about 7 times the score of Incredible Hulk.
Regardless, this film comes out to a 6.2, unfortunately placing it squarely in third place of the 3, with Spider-Man, the original 2002 Spider-Man, at a 6.3, Spider-Man 3 at a 6.2, Spider-Man 2 all the way up at the top, squarely with an 8.7. Boys, how we feeling about that placing?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, I'd say
I'm not gonna complain.
I'd say my thing is it's pretty on par with the first Spider-Man, but the core elements like the performances are better than in Spider-Man 1, so that's why I gave it an edge over it. But regardless, it's fine. I'm fine with the placing. We just have a very basic Raimi Spider-Man ranking now. But
yeah,
that's
we've
it.
got reasoning behind it. Math, boys. Math.
Yeah, math. In fact.
Figures.
And I can't believe we've come to the end of watching all the Spider-Man movies so soon. I can't believe it.
It's all over.
Thanks everyone for watching this journey so far. We'll get back to the MCU rank. I'm just kidding, of course. I don't know if you guys know this, but they rebooted Spider-Man like a few years after this with some Andrew Garfield kid. You guys know the guy from The Social Network? He's in it. That's crazy, right?
I'll be honest with you, Tanner. I don't want to watch these movies.
I'm waffling.
I don't know how to distribute a podcast, but I can make it easy.
We will be watching The Amazing Spider-Man next week. Yes, 2012's Mark Webb's The Amazing Spider-Man.
Oh, fuck it. I'm in. I'm down. Let's fucking enjoy this.
You know what? I've never seen it, but I will reserve judgment. I will reserve judgment until the point the credits roll.
But we'll see you guys then.
See you next week.
This from Harry Potter.